Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be tackling something, well, evil. We're going to be looking at evil.
Ooh.
Where do our ideas about evil come from?
Yeah.
Do they really reflect why people do bad things? Our source material for this one is a YouTube video summarizing Roy Baumeister's book, Evil: Inside Human Violence and Cruelty. But before we even get started, I want to pose this question to everybody listening. How do you define evil? I mean, is it this clear-cut category,
Or is it something a little more?
is it more complex than that?
It's a great question to think about because Baumeister actually argues that evil is surprisingly subjective. It's largely defined by the victim's experience, not necessarily the perpetrator's intentions.
Oh, interesting. So it's not as simple as just saying, oh, well, that person is evil.
Right, exactly. It's not just about labeling someone. He talks about what he calls the magnitude gap, which is basically the difference in how the victim and the perpetrator view the same act. So for the victim, it might feel intensely personal, malicious even if the perpetrator doesn't really see it that way.
I see. So, like, they're both looking at the same event, but
Yeah,
they have completely different understandings of that event.
exactly. They're operating on two totally different scales.
Gotcha. He uses the example of 9/11 to kind of illustrate this, right?
Yes, he does.
For the victims and the families, it was this unfathomable tragedy, this
Right.
deeply personal attack. But for the perpetrators, it was part of this larger ideological conflict. It wasn't really about those individuals.
Right.
So that kind of helps explain why a victim might perceive an act as pure evil, even if the perpetrator doesn't see themselves as, like, inherently bad.
Exactly. And this connects to, I think, a pretty common psychological bias where we tend to attribute intent to others' actions. But when we do something, it's because of situational factors.
Oh, for sure.
Like if someone cuts us off in traffic,
Yeah.
ugh, what a jerk.
What a judge.
But if we cut someone off, it's because we're in a hurry or, we're distracted.
Exactly. Yeah.
So this bias can really reinforce this perception of evil intent in others, even when there might be other explanations.
Yeah, it's like we're predisposed to think the worst of people, sometimes at least.
Yeah.
But Baumeister argues that this whole myth of pure evil, this idea of people being, like, inherently bad,
Mm.
or even deriving pleasure from inflicting harm,
Yeah.
that it's often just inaccurate.
Yeah, so he actually breaks down this myth a little bit, and he points out that it usually involves this idea of intentional harm for pleasure, purely innocent victims, and this belief that evil people are fundamentally different from us.
Uh-huh.
I mean, think about it. All the classic villains in movies and stories, they often embody these very characteristics,
Yeah.
But in reality, it's much more nuanced than that.
So if this pure evil is a myth, why do people do bad things? He outlines 4 primary causes. And the first one is this idea of means to an end.
Right, so think about it this way. Desperate circumstances driving people to harmful actions. So, stealing food because someone can't feed their family. The source material even talks about defrauding older individuals because they think, well, they have plenty of money, they won't miss it.
Yeah.
So it's this way of trying to rationalize these harmful actions, even though they're still wrong.
Right. The second cause is egotism.
Right. So this is where someone has this inflated self-esteem, and it leads them to lash out when they feel challenged or undermined. And so a classic example of this is domestic violence, stemming from a perceived threat to the abuser's ego.
Oh, wow.
So the abuser might feel like their authority or masculinity is being questioned, and that leads to violence as a way to reassert control.
So it can escalate really quickly from something that seems pretty minor, like a bruised ego,
Yeah, absolutely.
into something much darker. The third cause is idealism, which seems a little counterintuitive at first.
Yeah, because we typically associate idealism with positive things, right? But Baumeister actually points out that a strong belief in the righteousness of one's cause can lead to justifying almost any means to achieve it. And so history is full of examples. Nazi Germany, religious wars, where individuals believed their actions were totally justified, even if they caused immense suffering.
Yeah, it's like that. The ends justify the means thing. Take it to a whole other level.
It's extreme,
Yeah. And then finally, there's sadism,
Right.
which I guess is maybe the closest to what we traditionally think of as evil.
This one's the rarest of the 4 causes, and it involves deriving pleasure from inflicting pain on others. And trying to explain how that works psychologically, it can get a little technical.
Sure.
But you know how sometimes we enjoy scary movies?
Yeah.
Like experience the fear in the moment, right? But afterward, there's often this sense of relief and exhilaration.
Yeah, you get that rush.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so so Baumeister suggests that what he calls this rebound effect, this idea that we seek out these increasingly intense experiences for the thrill, that might also be a factor in sadistic behavior.
Wow, that's a scary thought.
Yeah.
But thankfully, most people don't act on these impulses, even if they might experience them from time to time. Baumeister talks about these inner restraints that we have
Right.
that usually stop us from doing harm,
Right. The things that prevent us from acting on those impulses.
even when we're tempted.
Exactly.
But the thing is that these inner restraints can be weakened
Hmm.
by various factors.
Yeah.
Like alcohol is an easy one, right?
Oh, for sure.
Because it lowers our inhibitions,
Yeah.
impairs our judgment.
Yep.
But he also talks about how group dynamics can play a role too. And he uses the example of firing squads, which for anybody who's not familiar, they were historically used for executions.
Yeah.
And you'd have multiple soldiers firing at the condemned individual.
Right.
And he points out that in some cases, members of the firing squad weren't told in advance that they were going to be participating in the execution.
Wow.
So it creates this situation where panic, fear of being seen as the enemy if they refuse,
Yeah.
that could actually override their moral considerations.
So it's like even in such a serious situation, the pressure to conform
Yeah.
can overwhelm your individual moral restraint.
Yeah. It makes me think, like, have you ever been in a situation where you felt pressured by a group to do something that you weren't totally comfortable with? And how did that affect your sense of responsibility?
That's a great question. I think recognizing those pressures is key to understanding how these evil acts can even occur, even among people who wouldn't normally consider themselves capable of that.
Right. Yeah, it seems like we're starting to see how this idea of evil
Hmm.
is much less about this inherent badness in people and more about a complex interaction of motivations, social pressures, situational factors.
Absolutely. And that leads us to some interesting questions
Right.
about how we define and address harmful behavior. But before we get into that, I think it's worth looking a little deeper into how our perceptions of evil are shaped by conflict and our tendency to see the world in terms of us versus them.
Okay, let's get into that. That us versus them thing is really interesting to me because Baumeister actually connects that directly to the very concept of evil. He points out that the word devil originally comes from the word adversary.
Yeah, it's almost like language itself reveals this kind of underlying connection.
Yeah.
Like the idea that evil is actually rooted in opposition, in seeing someone as our enemy. It really challenges us to look at how we perceive those that we disagree with.
It's so easy to slip into that,
Yeah.
us versus them
Yeah.
mentality. Even in pretty mundane situations, like, if you disagree with somebody's political views, it's easy to go from that to thinking they're the embodiment of everything wrong with the world.
Oh, I know. It happens all the time. And the source material uses this example of, like, someone reacting really aggressively to a differing belief. And it just highlights how easily we can escalate from disagreement to seeing the other person as a threat or even as evil.
It's like our brains are wired to make anybody who challenges our beliefs into the bad guy.
Yeah, it's like this knee-jerk reaction we have to demonize anyone who opposes us.
Makes you wonder if maybe evil is less about specific actions and more about how we frame them in our minds.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And
And this tendency to kind of demonize opponents. I mean, it's played out throughout history, hasn't it?
totally.
Like from tribal conflicts to political polarization, we constantly divide ourselves into these good guys and bad guys.
Yeah. And Baumeister argues that this tendency is actually, it's made worse by what he sees as a lack of a strong unifying moral framework. In modern society,
Right. He's suggesting that the erosion of these traditional values has led to this greater focus on selfish gain, which in turn fuels conflict and makes it easier to justify harmful actions. It makes me wonder, do you feel like there are clear, agreed upon moral values in society today?
that's a tough question.
It is.
On the one hand, we have more freedom and individual expression than ever, but it can feel like,
Yeah.
in a way, we've lost our moral compass,
Yeah.
and we're just adrift
Yeah.
in this sea of
Yeah.
competing values
Yeah.
and ideologies.
Right. And without that kind of shared compass, it becomes a lot easier to rationalize our own actions, to kind of downplay the harm we cause and even to demonize those who stand in our way. It kind of brings us back to that magnitude gap that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
We don't have this shared understanding of what even constitutes wrong behavior. Then it becomes way easier to minimize our own transgressions, but magnify the evil that we see in others.
So then, how do we hold people accountable for their actions? I mean, if evil is often in the eye of the beholder, like Baumeister says, does that mean that justice is subjective too?
That's a really good question. It's a tough one, too, and it really goes to the heart of our legal and ethical systems.
Yeah.
Baumeister doesn't necessarily provide any easy answers, but he does encourage us to move beyond these simplistic notions of good and evil and really try to focus on understanding the complexities of human behavior and the factors that contribute to these actions.
So it's less about punishment
Mm-hmm.
and more about trying to understand why people do bad things in the first place.
I think so. It's about shifting to this more nuanced understanding, recognizing that while individuals are responsible for their choices, those choices are often influenced by a whole web of factors that go way beyond simple good and evil.
So I guess it's about finding that balance, right?
Yeah.
Holding people accountable while also acknowledging the circumstances
Hmm.
that might have contributed to their actions.
Exactly. It's about moving towards a more holistic approach that combines accountability with understanding the root causes of that behavior.
Yeah.
Maybe it's about exploring strategies for prevention and rehabilitation and even addressing some of those systemic issues that might be contributing to these actions in the first place.
So after all this, diving deep into Baumeister's work,
Mhm.
I keep coming back to this question. If we move away from this black and white view of evil, are we just letting people off the hook for their actions?
I don't think it's about letting people off the hook at all. It's more about shifting to a more nuanced understanding of why people do bad things. It's recognizing that individuals are responsible for their choices.
Mhm.
But those choices are often influenced by, well, a whole bunch of different factors. It's not just good and evil, right?
So maybe it's more about trying to find that balance
Yeah.
between holding people accountable, but also acknowledging the circumstances that might have played a role in their actions.
Exactly. It's about moving towards this more holistic approach to justice that combines accountability with really getting at the root causes of harmful behavior.
Yeah.
Like maybe it involves exploring strategies for prevention or rehabilitation and even addressing some of those systemic issues that might be contributing to these actions in the first place.
It seems like Baumeister's research really challenges a lot of our assumptions about evil. We often think about it as this: rare, monstrous quality that only certain people possess.
Right.
But what he's suggesting is that we all have the capacity
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
evil.
I'll have that potential, yeah.
It's just a matter of whether our inner restraints hold up under pressure.
Exactly. And those pressures, they can come from all sorts of places. We talked about desperation, egotism, ideology, even just the influence of the groups we're in. I think it's a good reminder that even seemingly good people can be driven to do harmful things under the wrong circumstances.
Yeah. I think that idea of the devil as our adversary is so powerful because it shows how easily we can demonize anyone who opposes us.
Right. It doesn't even have to be something huge.
Yeah.
Like, it could be a political debate or even just a disagreement with a friend and suddenly...
Yeah, and you think they're the worst person in the world
Exactly.
because they have a different opinion.
Yeah. It's a call to, be more mindful of our own biases.
Yeah.
To really question our assumptions.
Yeah.
And to try to understand other people's perspectives, even when we might be tempted to label them as evil.
Because if we can understand what leads people to do bad things, maybe we can actually prevent them from happening in the first place.
Right. Wouldn't that be great?
Yeah.
I think the more we understand about human behavior, the better equipped we are to create a more just and compassionate world.
Well, that about wraps it up for this deep dive into the nature of evil.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for joining us, and thank you for listening, everybody. We'll be back next time with another fascinating exploration.
Thank you.
Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.